Good morning. It's good to see you all out here this day. So we're going to continue our study in Colossians. I'm going to start reading in chapter 3, and then we'll have an opening prayer. For I want you to know how great a struggle I have. I'm in chapter 2. There we go. If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you: sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. In these you too once walked, when you were living in them. But now you must put them all away: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge, after the image of its Creator. Here there is not a Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all. Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing one another, and, if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you are called in one body. And be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, with thankfulness in your hearts to God. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Wives, submit to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ, for the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. Fred?
Father God, thank you for this opportunity this morning to come together and study your word, worship you. Father, as we study your word together, we pray that you would bless us with clear minds to look at it carefully and to think of all that you've done for us and how you have planned for us from the very beginning, knowing that we would be a sinful people, that we would be rebellious to you. Father, you made ways for us to come back to you. And we're so thankful for the gift of Christ, for his sacrifice, for the love that you've shown, so that we can be redeemed, that we can be cleansed and return to you. Father, help us as we study these scriptures to not just check a box as having read your scriptures today and talk about it, but allow it to affect our hearts, to change our hearts, so that we might truly change the course of our lives. Father, thank you for the earthly blessings you've given us. Thank you for the spiritual blessings. Help us to recognize the importance and prioritize the spiritual above the earthly. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Thank you. So we're going to be starting a little bit into chapter 3. So just as a review, chapter 1 basically has an introduction and a brief description of who is Christ and what Christ does for us. And then chapter 2, he goes a little bit more into it as far as who Christ is and how probably many there were being distracted from him, how many there were being pulled away from him by deceitful doctrines and false theologies, false ideas. there are many different ways in which you can separate this out, whichever works best for you. I mean, it doesn't really do much except for your organization. How I tend to look at it is introduction, how you err by trying to be too spiritual, and then inadvertently end up focusing too much on the earthly things. And then chapter 3, how you err by focusing too much on the earthly things themselves directly. In the first part of 3, how it mentions there, set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on the earth. When looking at it as a continuation of the last portion of chapter 2, the last verse of chapter 2, it just makes me feel like they are so focused on the earthly things that they're trying to avoid it and falling into a pitfall of false wisdom there by completely separating themselves from some of these earthly things where they didn't need to. And so they're still focused on it, so focused on trying to avoid these earthly temptations that they're causing other problems. But that's just how one way of looking at it. If that doesn't help you, then throw it out the window. There's many different ways that I've seen, so whatever works best for you, that's the important thing, how to organize this in your mind. I guess the important thing is what it's actually saying. Organization is secondary, I should say. But then, excuse me, in verse 5, he goes into 3 different listings there. So the first one, in verse 5, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you: sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, covetousness, which is idolatry. What do those things mean? What do some of those words mean? What does it mean, passion? I mean, some, like evil desire, desiring evil things, pretty simple. But covetousness, what does that mean? What does it mean to be covetous? I mean, that's a big word that's not used nowadays very often, but what does that mean? Wanting what other people have? Yeah, wanting in the extreme, wanting to where that's everything. Very good. Any other thoughts?
I think covetousness and the way it's used here is, to me, it's I want what you have instead of you have, or I want something instead of somebody else.
Yeah, that's a nice book you got there. I'll take it. Hey, look at my nice book. Yeah, it's a wanting of what other people have. I like all of the definitions that you guys used, and I'm sure we all can see how easily that can cause problems. What about impurity? What does that word mean there? You might have a different word there, but just in general, what does that mean? Does that mean anything special, or is it just face value?
It's got to do with the mind. Somebody's got an impure mind.
Yeah, an impurity of what's inside, of who they are truly. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Not whole, or the duplicitous in their mind. They act one way one time and another way another time.
Yeah, impure means not all one, and in this case, not all of God. We have both what we should be, but also what we shouldn't be. Yeah, duplicity. Any other thoughts? What about passion? What does it mean by passion there? Because in today's age, passion is considered a good thing in a lot of cases. He has passion for his work. He has passion for his hobbies. You can tell he's really good because he has passion for it.
I think maybe in the negative, a lack of self-control.
A pursuit and lack of self-control, yeah.
My version here says inordinate affection. So it's not just passion, but it's passion misplaced where it ought not be.
Yeah, where it shouldn't be, perhaps and stronger than it needs to be, it's not as it should be. We can definitely, go ahead.
And I might add too that most of what I see here has to do with, your mind or your spirit, or, in the spirit realm, because it ends up possessing you kind of internally, and then that's going to shape your behavior.
And that's a very good point. That leads me into how some people have categorized the first 5 things here, is that they are internal things. They are things that really take root down deep, and perhaps that's why it says, put to death these things. You would think you want to put to death all things that are wrong, but yet in the next section, you'll see we just have to put them off. Did I see a hand over here?
I think you kind of mentioned the fact that passion itself, it can be a negative thing, but it can also be a positive thing. I mean, like, I might say, I have a passion for God, zealousness there for Him.
Yeah, you have to have that pursuit, that desire where it needs to be, where it should be, where it's supposed to be. Like all things that God has given us, if we use them wrongly, they become folly. Very good point.
Like this entire list, you have to look at that end phrase there, which is what I like, right? So every one of these, in the modern vernacular, a lot of these words are tamp down. And I think in this context, all of these are things that you are pursuing and that you want. And these are things that you started to worship and God.
Exactly. These are things that we have replaced God with in our hearts, in our lives. So let's go down to the second one, the second listing here. It is verse 8. But now you must put them all away: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. Why mention anger and wrath separately here? I mean, we use them today as synonyms. I mean, they mean basically the same thing. He is wrathful. He is angry. I guess, so we can put full at the end since angerful isn't really a word. I don't know. But what is the difference between some of these words, or are they the same thing? What does other translations have? What do you think about those?
I think of wrath, I think of anger in action. I can be angry and I can sit here and be angry. But to be wrathful means that you're putting that anger into practice, into some action.
Yeah, perhaps it implies an action behind it. Very good, yeah. Any other thoughts?
I think of the verse over in Romans 1:18, where Paul talks about the wrath of God being revealed in heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. So wrath is, like Scott said, it goes beyond anger. What are you going to do about it? Or what you intend to do about it? Or what you do about it?
Mm-hmm. So perhaps anger with motive, or with motion to it, with action behind it.
Building on that too, wrath oftentimes is a more deep-seated anger. Anger, like a lot of emotions, has a lot of different levels. That I can be upset or angered by someone's action, and like has already been mentioned, you want to just kind of brush that off and let it go. But if there's something that is a more deep-seated anger, particularly something, the way I think of it is something that needs to be avenged, or something that needs to be responded to, usually in a forceful and or harsh manner, is more geared towards the wrathful end of things. So that's being mentioned in 2 different formats here, in my mind anyway, kind of helps stabilize or adds to that concept that there being levels of this, and that it's not just a matter of paying attention to what is upsetting, but how upset you're getting about it and responding appropriately accordingly, whether it is I need to respond to this or I need to respond to myself and correct my error.
Very good. I won't try to summarize that. There's a lot of good points in there, though.
I think it kind of is, you commented that passion today means one thing, and historically, passion was not always positive at all. The positive is having a well-ordered life, which meant feeling like your passion is driving your life. And whether you're having a free thought or anger or wrath, clearly you're letting passion ride instead of seeking God or
Yeah, and some people have thought that the second verse is the effects of letting the second list, letting the effects of the first list into your heart. As far as the words themselves, Greek-wise, while they do have some overlap, the anger word that they use there can have the meaning of more of an impulse, more of a reactionary thing, while wrath is more of a full-blown outburst of it. Both have a few little different nuances, and perhaps, go ahead.
NIV renders the word wrath with
Rage, yes. And so they definitely have a lot of overlap, and while we may never know exactly the difference, they are close enough, and we have a good idea of them enough to know to avoid those kind of things. The others, malice. What is malice?
I think of malice as wanting bad for somebody else, to the point where it consumes you. All you want is something bad to happen to somebody else. It's malicious, and it's a cancer within people. It's hard to do it.
Yeah, a desiring of harm for somebody to any extent. Very good. Any others? Some have translated it as spite or wickedness. What about spite? Does spite mean anything different to you? Go ahead. Doing it with the intent to harm. Probably the only time that we commonly use spite is, I think, the only phrase I can think of is to cut off your nose to spite your face. That entails the intent to do harm, not only because they want to do harm, but even to harm yourself. You will do it as long as you can harm this person. It's an extreme hatred, really, an evilness and a wickedness.
Yeah, it's like to other things, you talk about malicious doing something deliberately with an intent to harm, but there can be other motives behind it. Spiteful seems to be more effectively an element of I'm doing harm for the sake of harm.
Yeah, perhaps the wrath is more of the outburst with the perceived motive, while spite and malice is more of I'm doing it just because it feels good, because I just want to hurt people. Perhaps, yeah. Any other thoughts?
I think all of these words, I know you're not done looking at all of them, but all of them imply an improper perspective of reality from God, the way God wants us to be. God wants us to be forgiving and kind and loving and recognizing that sometimes people have bad days, they do things, and we have to look past some things and be patient with them and just resist the temptation to hang on to some bad thing so that we can retaliate or hate them or want bad for them. These are improper perspectives.
Definitely corrupt. And stop looking at the next list. But no, very, very good points. Any other thoughts about this before we go on to the last two? All right. What about slander? We don't really use it nowadays, at least not in most people's line of work. I mean, unless you're in the entertainment industry, slander really isn't that common a thing, and even then it's more of a legal term. The only thing I can think of is that Spider-Man quote, that's slander. No, it's in print. It's libel, or something like that. But we only have a legal definition of it nowadays. But what does slander mean? Not the legal definition, but the word itself. What does it mean?
It'd be a misrepresentation of someone.
Could be a misrepresentation. I think that's more definitely the modern sense of it, yeah.
Saying bad about somebody, something about somebody,
Yeah, saying,
whether it's true or not.
yeah, it's saying bad regardless if it's true or not. The word itself can also be translated blasphemy, abusive or scurrilous language. So harmful language regardless of truth or not. And we have, at least in the modern sense, have really hooked onto that it's not true meaning of it but it does have more of a negative, more of a hurtful connotation with those meanings. What about obscene talk? The last one there. What is it?
Abusive, unwholesome.
Unwholesome? Abusive? Filthy language, yeah. Any others?
I'll just say morally degenerate.
Morally degenerate. So, in short, saying things that we ought not to say in the way we ought not to speak. So, basically, let your speech be seasoned with salt. It doesn't tell us, okay, don't use these words, but each of those words are going to have a different meaning based on the culture. It's more of the meaning behind them. We need to make sure that our language isn't foul, isn't filthy, isn't obscene, isn't hurtful. We need to make sure that when we are speaking, that we are not emulating any of these properties. And the last question I have, well, not the last period, but the last one about these 5 words is what kind of links all these together? What is something that is similar about all these? And why are we only told to put them away, not to put them to death? Is there a difference there? I know it's a 2-part question, but what about those things? Why is it different than the first list? Or if it is, how?
I don't know if this is what you're going for or not, but I think when you look at those, they're absolutely, you look at them individually, right, it gives you an idea of this and of that. But I think you have to look at them all together. They all kind of have that Venn diagram commonality. You know, wrath and anger kind of overlap a little bit, slander and malice kind of overlap a little bit. It's almost like that old story of the blind man describing an elephant, and each reach out and grab one piece of it, and they have mistakes really different. You have to take them all together to really get the full context of what it's looking at.
Very good. Yeah, I wish we would have had that idea of a Venn diagram. That would have been a great one. Yeah, I like it. But no, yeah, they all have a little bit of each other in them. Yeah, very good point.
To me, looking through this list, it almost seems like it's building on itself as it goes. You're not going to get to the next point unless you have the previous point as you work up there. And then that also recalls my mind to the verse that says, be angry and sin not. So starting there with anger, which is something that you can viably have, but if it's not directed appropriately, can lead to other things. That concept of putting it away potentially could be looking at the fact of saying, starting with this element of, look, you can have this element and be perfectly in the right, but if you travel down this road with it, then you're not anymore. Whereas the previous list, there's nothing in that list that you can legitimately be acting on and still be acting in a faithful manner.
Yeah, so while we can be angry, we can do so and not sin, but we need to put that off because otherwise we're going to go down that path of going wrath, malice, slander, etc. Yeah, very good point. Very good point. Any other thoughts?
You asked why should we set these aside as opposed to put them to death? I think that, I think about the passage that says, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. These are things that belong to the Lord. We recognize that they exist and that He has done these things with people that He's angry with, etc., and He wants to punish. I don't know, that's a good question, why it's set aside instead of saying put him to death, but it seems to me it's just, I shouldn't have these perspectives in my mind. I'm going to set them aside for God. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, the only thing is the obscene talk and potentially slander, depending on your definition of it, that God doesn't do. But yeah, I like that thoughts that you're having that this isn't for us. Perhaps anger, wrath, and such are for God to execute judgment on, not us though. So we need to put them aside.
I would say too, the second list has to do more toward another person, you know.
More of an action, more of an interaction, yeah.
One another, the first list has to do with your spiritual, you know, moral degenerate state of being. It's not necessarily toward a
Yeah, and that's basically the thing that I've seen most in some of the commentaries I've read. But the first list is more of the internal, more the things that involve me, myself, and I. While the other things, while you are still part of that, it does have to have that other person, whether or not they're willingly or not, whether or not it's just your impression of them, but still you have to have that 1-2 relationship. And so that these are more action-driven, more interpersonal. Versus inside oneself. And so perhaps we need to put those actions away. You can't put to death in action, so you have to put it off. Same way you can't put to death a piece of clothing, you have to take it off. Any other thoughts on these? All right, now we get to the good list. Actually, one other note about that. So we have the list of 5, and then Paul adds on basically, do not lie to one another. So it doesn't seem to be in that same list. It seems to be a continuation. But just one note of this is that only in Ephesians and Colossians that I've seen anyway, does Paul really warn about lying, especially within the church. You may say, liars and whatnot aren't going to die, but he's actually saying do not lie. He's actually going into a little bit more detail about it. Mainly because do not lie to one another. Not just do not lie, period, but do not lie one to another. Perhaps because of all these things involving lying, perhaps because lying is the last thing to come from this thing, such as Mark was kind of hinting at. Perhaps that's because of the deceit that people were being led astray, as it was mentioned in early chapter 2. But just one little note there before we go on to the last section. All right. So then let's go on to verse 12. Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. So I think we have a lot more familiarity with these words, at least with reading our Bibles. They're used a lot more frequently, and so we have a lot more understanding of these. But in short, what do some of these mean? Especially, what's the difference between humility and meekness? Because we use those words a lot interchangeably, but what's the difference there? Does one have a slightly different meaning? Or is he just saying that twice because you really need to be meek and humble? Humility and gentleness. So perhaps one is more inside and one is more outside. Any other thoughts?
I always think of them as humility is an internal perspective, and meekness is strength under control. It's with your internal perspective, you exert yourself under control.
So you start with humility, and that leads to meekness as far as how you're interacting with others, how you're controlling yourself and what you do. Very good, yeah. Any other thoughts? No? All right. So then, what about compassionate hearts? We'll start at the first. And some may have kind bowels here. I've seen a few translations translate to that, because this isn't the word for heart, which is cardia, but just innards, basically. You have to have kind innards. It's just commonly translated to hearts because of our common vernacular today, but I just find that slightly humorous, that we need to have compassionate bowels. Just don't eat Taco Bell, I guess. But any comments, any thoughts about that?
Is that the word for kindness of yourself?
Compassionate hearts. The very first one. What does a compassionate heart look like?
I think it has to do with desiring what's right for someone else. I think about Jesus having compassion on people, looking at people with compassion, because he was therefore willing to do what was good for that person.
Yeah, an emulation of Jesus to where we think about the others and put them first. Very good, yeah. Any other thoughts?
Is that the same word except you add the word calm in front of it?
So in verse 12 it says, put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, is what mine says there. What does yours say?
Heart of compassion. I'm just
Oh.
going to get the word compassion. Earlier we talked about passion.
Mhm.
Passion
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying now. Let me actually,
I'm just wondering,
I'll get to the actual word itself.
putting Tom in front of it makes it refer to,
Perhaps in English. I don't know the etiology of that word. But the Greek word is okitiermo. It's also translated as pity, compassion, favor, grace, or mercy. So those are some other definitions of it. I don't know if it is related to passion, perhaps in our vernacular, our language, but in Greek, no. Any other comments on that?
Generally, and it seems to be another builder, as we go through those elements, you can do them individually, but they're not going to have the same impact, the same overall effect, either on the person, the other people that you're interacting with, or on your own part, pull them apart from each other, as opposed to starting with a concern for others, and then moving to.
Yeah. Another growth tree. Start with the first one and then steadily expand.
I would also add, be sensitive to another's weakness or shortcomings. When you talk about power and mercy, sometimes we can be callous. You see someone on the street, why don't they have a job? Too many jobs around. Be sensitive to their shortcomings. What may seem simple to us may not be so simple to them for reasons that we may not even understand. It goes back to childhood issues or whatever. Be sensitive to it.
Yeah.
That's all.
Pity. Pity is a good word for that. Putting them first, trying to give them the benefit of the doubt in every way, trying to treat it as if there's a lot I don't know, and assuming the best for them and trying to help them in any way you can. A very good representation of it. Very good. Any other thoughts before we go on to another word?
what would be the opposite of this? I'm just curious.
Angry innards, I guess. I mean, that's a good question. What would be an opposite?
Compassionate, if we're thinking about it in English, we're to refrain from being passionate ourselves in the prior verse. We're to refrain from being ruled by our emotions. But when we're compassionate, we can be with someone else in their passion. So we can be understanding when we're dealing with someone who's maybe being ruled by their emotions. We can say, well, I know what that's like, or I understand that they don't mean it that way, or they're saying something in anger, they're being passionate, but I'm not going to let myself become angry or offended by that. I'm going to be compassionate. I'm going to be sympathetic toward their passions. I think the opposite would be callousness or just coldness toward their compassion, or a short temper or a lack of mercy when it comes to they said something to me in anger, so they're going to get it right back to them instead of saying, hey, they're having a bad day, or they were impassioned when they said that. They probably didn't mean it that way. And I'm going to do some better.
Yeah, perhaps passion is better applied when for another versus for yourself. And then, very good, antonym of compassion.
I'm teaching a teenager how to drive right now.
Okay.
There's a lot of the, think of when you're driving, about somebody pissed you off, going, just let them in. They always leave if you're in a hurry for something, and just let it go. Don't get angry about it. Maybe the kids keep you in front for some reason. And you could ball that up inside, angry all the rest of the day, or just lay off react, that's what happens.
Yeah.
You see a lot of that.
Yeah, you letting them, putting them first because all it's going to cost you is a second or two. Yeah, very good. Any other thoughts?
Building on Eric's comment, in terms of the opposite between judgment and evil assumptions. Again, building on what he was saying, you see that person by the side of the road, is your immediate concern for their well-being, or is your immediate jump to, well, they're there because they deserve it, they're there because they made pro-life choices, they're there as a result of their own actions, I don't want to get involved, I've been cheated before. Where does your mind go?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Is your mind based on helping, or is your mind based on all the reasons why it's not your problem?
yeah. Are you assuming the best? Are you actually caring about the person, or are you basically talking slander with yourself about them, talking bad things about them, assuming the worst, whether it's true or not?
Yeah, in discussing this morning, there's lots of things
Yeah, perhaps that's why in verse 14 it says, above all, put on love. A love is the most important of these, but yet still separate. It's mentioned separately perhaps because love binds everything together in perfect harmony. We'll get to that in just one more minute. I just want to mention kindness. What does kindness mean? Just hit all of our bases there, hit all of our points. What does kindness mean? This one we use every day. What does it mean?
Being opportunistic to do good things to other people.
Good things to other people. Sounds pretty good? All right. So we'll go on to love. So love binds everything together. Let me actually read there in 14, if I can find it. All right. Above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. Does that mean it binds us together? Does that mean it binds these 5 things together, or both? Can you have a compassionate heart without love? Can you have patience or meekness or humility? I guess I did skip patience there, but that's fine. We're low on time. But can you have any of these 5 things without love, or can you do them adequately without love? I see.
But you cannot do them adequately, and it's not going to have the same optimal effect again on the one that you're acting towards or towards yourself.
Yeah, you may be able to do something, but it's not going to be as it should be because you're lacking something. Very good, yeah. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that I think in our world today around us, we see a big emphasis, hey, be kind, be compassionate, even in people, even, just in our world, whether it be, the workspace, where we are, we're going to be kind, be compassionate, see the same individual. I think within Scripture, in context, love, it is what binds these things together. When we work them independently, it can sometimes be easy to manipulate or use to our advantage or you name it, and I think we see that, just a bit of outrage because kindness isn't what makes everything. Compassion isn't what makes everything. There's love that at the heart of all of it binds these things together in a complete form. And the Scripture relays that, puts it in a context that is beyond just how can I individually these traits operate. There's something deeper to it as well.
The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Yes, very good. That's the best way I can summarize that. There's a lot of good points in there, but very good.
Well, it depends on the word love that's used here, and I assume it's the word agape.
Yeah.
Which means seeking the best interest of someone else. All these other things, these attitudes, these problems that we get into in our mind, are sometimes failures to consider what is best for other people. It's like we was talking about earlier, if somebody's angry and it frustrates you, instead of assuming the worst, assume the best if they're having a bad day. And if you want to do something, it's my goal, my mission to try to help be the salve that calms their wounds and helps them to see God. Just doing what's best in the best interest of somebody else.
Yeah, putting somebody else first, foremost, over yourself, the same way Christ did for us. Excellent definition, really, of love, and way of emulating it, yeah.
Well, without love, you're just like a bell factory. You're just building. And people give people things all the time. It has nothing to do with love. Sometimes it's self-serving. Sometimes whatever. It makes me look big. It makes me look, whatever. Without love, Paul said, conquer the world and just be allowed normal.
Mm-hmm. And if it has not love,
You've got to have the love behind driving that work. Otherwise, it's just detached act.
you got to have good motives. Otherwise, you can easily be pulled down a path that you shouldn't go. Yeah, very good.
He's just warned them against, in chapter 2, self-made religion and asceticism,
And perhaps that's why it had the semblance of wisdom, but wasn't actually wise. Yeah, very good point.
I can be gentle and patient with someone because I pity them. And that's not love. Love is a very difficult thing to do. It requires actually sacrifice.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah, it's a very difficult thing. It's a very hard thing to want to do. It's a hard thing to fulfill to do. It's a hard thing to do rightly. But it's something that is wonderful to do. It's a very good point.
I kind of like the phrase he keeps using here. He's used it like 3 times, I think, within the context where it says, put on. You put on these things. It reminds me of Galatians 3:27 where it says, for all of you who have been baptized into Christ, put on Christ, some versions say, or other versions say, clothe yourself with Christ, like putting on a garment. And this is not necessarily something you wear, these particular things, but like we've talked about, they come from the heart, they come from inside, from a changed person. So it reminds me, all these things remind me that, Christ expects us to have self-control in our lives.
Yeah, it's a wonderful thing that Christ has given us. It's not something that comes from within inside us. It's the new man that he has made us, that he has given us. It's the new self. It's the new clothing. It's the clean garments, new life. He has given us these things, and it's not from ourselves, but from him. Very good point.
I wanted to circle back to the very beginning of class. We were talking about transitioning from chapter 2 into chapter 3. And all this discussion about what's inside of us, what's in our hearts, and starting from that vantage point. I think what helps me properly understand chapter 2, starting with like in verse 16, it says, therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath day. These cultural things that the Jews were focused on, these outside external things, I'm doing this, I'm keeping the Sabbath, I'm not working, reminds me of the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. How the Pharisee, Luke 18:10-11, the Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, I pay tithes of all that I get. He's focused on, I do this, I check this box, but perhaps his heart, most likely his heart is not in it. And he's become self-righteous and judgmental and looks down on somebody who's not doing those things. In those things, I think, in summary, back to Colossians 2, verse 23, these are matters which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom, but they are of no value against fleshly indulgence. You can be checking these boxes here and here and here, but it's not helping you because you haven't changed your heart, and that's why you need Christ. Put off these things, be dead to immorality, purity, anger, wrath, and put on these things. It's got to start from the heart. So anyway, that's a good.
That's a very good. That's a good point to end on. That's a wonderful point. Yeah, that's how we have wisdom. That's how we put off and actually put away these earthly things, is by holding on to these things and putting on these things. Very good points. Yeah. Any other last-minute thoughts, questions, ideas? All right. Well, we'll continue next Wednesday then, Lord willing. Thank you.